Hello and welcome to this video on one of the most horrifying fates in the Warhammer 40k universe, interment in a Dreadnought sarcophagi. In the Warhammer universe, everything is grimdark. Even the communist blueberry's utopia has some aspects that are grimdark. We would argue that the worst fate possible is still within the hands of the Imperium of Man. Most would counter and tell us it is the Dark Elder who live a life of debauchery by literally torturing the life essence out of their victims to avoid ending up in the hands of Slaanesh. The problem we have with that is that at least the victim dies. Eventually. Yes, it is horrifying and cruel, but it does have an eventual end. Strictly speaking, a Dreadnought does not. Well, not a natural end anyway. The battle brother who was so fortunate, or perhaps so very unfortunate, as to be injured severely enough that an apothecary cannot heal them, is in for one of two futures. Death, or if they are an odd member of the chapter, they may be, luckily, put into a Dreadnought. The Dreadnought is the Space Marine Walker armoured unit. It is made up of a body containing the sarcophagi in which the venerable Space Marine is interned, a pair of legs, and two hardpoints on each side that can be fitted with arms or weapon pods. As we earlier mentioned, the Space Marine interred has been severely injured, which takes a lot for the Space Marine. It has to do more than just cause a major wound. Unlike a mere mortal human, it takes what to a human is anti-tank ammunition to put down a Space Marine, and even that may not be enough Daka. But don't worry, there is always room for more Daka. Once the Space Marine has, for example, lost both their hearts, all three lungs, and expired their weird suspended animation trick, then they earn the category to be placed within the sarcophagi, possibly. This is why we say it is a terrifying fate. The Dreadnought sarcophagi will keep the Space Marine alive for centuries and possibly longer. The Dreadnought is like a sarcophagus went through an episode of Pimp My Ride in the 41st millennia. It is a coffin that still has a living person in it, but it looks really fancy. A very small silver lining is that at least they are kept in a state of suspended animation most of the time, and only woken up from their deep sleep when needed. Still, being woken from what might pass as a tolerable rest to agony until you sleep again, if you can sleep again, seems horrifying, and the time between being woken up and going to sleep again may be quite long depending on how long they're needed for and depending on the circumstances of the exact campaign. In the Imperium, technology is somewhat inseparable from faith, and the problem is that the sarcophagus is not only consecrated by tech priests, which seems something of an oxymoron, but they do so with sacred oils, runes, and rituals to ensure that the machine spirit of the Dreadnought will harmonize with the Space Marine soul. This is supposed to prevent things like corruption or malfunction, as the Adeptus Mechanicus thinks of interment as a sacred union of man and machine. Sacred is not quite the word we'd use, but sure. The Space Marine's interment is often accompanied by various ceremonies, and the sarcophagus is treated almost like a reliquary of a living hero. This is supposed to reinforce the occupants' will to endure and live, as they see their service as a divine duty, and depending on the chapter, this may or may not be the case. But that's not necessarily a solution to the problem, especially once you start getting into the centuries and millennia of service, if you aren't destroyed somehow before then. So next time your doctor starts singing hymns and wafting a censer full of smoke after you describe your symptoms, consider finding a new doctor before they inter you too. With that nightmare fuel percolating through your brain, let's look at how they make this living horror show a reality. The main areas we need to look at are going to be basic metabolism and nutrition of the victim, respiration, because they do need to breathe, and dealing with the injuries sustained and connecting the Space Marine to the Dreadnought, along with waking and sleeping in the Dreadnought. Each has its, let's say, merits and demerits in terms of feasibility. Basic sustenance is always going to be a problem. It doesn't matter how advanced your super warrior is, they will need to eat at some point. It just doesn't matter. All living organisms need calories along with other nutrients to survive. You cannot have a Space Marine live without some kind of sustenance. Alongside sustenance, we also have waste products, but everything in order, and that is actually the order. If we talk about a modern scenario where you have someone on life support, they cannot eat normally in many cases, and they'll be provided nutrition through, say, enteral feeding. That's basically a tube directly into the stomach or intestines, or something nasogastric or a peg tube, and this is done via the mouth down into the stomach, and then finally parenteral nutrition. This is intravenous delivery of nutrition. Enteral feeding is generally preferred when the digestive system is functional, meaning that they can continue to live, and considering what we described as far as traumatic injuries required to put a Space Marine in a Dreadnought, probably not likely. There's a very good chance that a large portion of their abdomen probably is missing if it doesn't have large holes in it. So you do require a somewhat more direct means of delivering things like proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, vitamins, and minerals. This is where parenteral nutrition is used, because obviously the GI tract really can't be used if it's not there. It bypasses the need to digest food and directly delivers it into the bloodstream. This is sort of what we see with the Dreadnought sarcophagi. It's filled with a nutrient-rich amniotic fluid. It's a biogel that's meant to provide the Space Marine with all its nourishment, but realistically, possibly, but probably not the case. This isn't really feasible because, although the fluid does provide everything needed, it's not able to get into the bloodstream very easily, assuming they've actually treated the wounds and injuries. But theoretically, perhaps there's some mechanism in place that's allowing it to be, let's say, pumped into the vascular system otherwise, and it still cycles through, and the essentially a weird amniotic sac is a sort of a massive reservoir of this material. Next we have a fluid in that environment that's going to provide an opportunity for not just oxygen, that is the amniotic fluid, but nutrients and to a certain extent waste removal, although we would argue that removing the waste into the environment around the Space Marine doesn't actually remove the waste. It actually creates a huge problem in terms of environmental toxicity. And this does, to some extent, make up for the loss of normal organ function, but even then it's a very poor replacement as an artificial bloodstream and respiratory system. Somewhat associated with that is the loss of some major organs, for example kidneys, which are needed to maintain, primarily we're talking here about ion balance and blood volume, but ion balance in this circumstance is probably the more relevant, and there's no obvious way for that to be done. With food in fact, any energy in, feces comes out, and this is another reason why we mentioned the kidneys, because, well, the kidneys are going to have an obligatory amount of fluid removed anyway, and how much feces is going to be generated is going to be based on a variety of factors, other than, obviously, blood volume and obligatory function. You have things like fiber content, delivery method, and the composition. Assuming that this is a essentially stock solution, delivered whether intravenously or otherwise is less important, there will be some waste generated. If nothing else, you will have the renal system or kidneys removing an obligatory volume of water from the blood volume. An obligatory volume is the amount that must be removed to ensure renal function. Of course, we assume the kidneys are still present in the Space Marine. If they're not, you do need something functionally equivalent to a dialysis machine attached to this, and dialysis machines do, to an extent, require replacement components to be inserted to allow for the filtration effect. The, let's say, solution is actually one that is used in life support patients now, and it's an indwelling catheter. This is used mostly for fecal management, but strictly speaking, any sort of catheter could be used on the other side to deal with urine. It's a flexible tube that is, put up into the anus or rectum and then sealed with a flexi seal, and this will collect the feces in a closed drainage bag. Now, this is relatively common for patients with diarrhea, incontinence, or similar issues, and it does, to an extent, help with things like skin breakdown and infection risk. It does also mean that somewhere inside the Dreadnought, there is a poop bag. Theoretically, an ever-increasing in size poop bag. The only uncertainty is if it is freeze-dried somehow to ensure minimal weight and volume, and theoretically possibly recover water from it, or if they just have a giant, stinky, sloshy bag of poop. On to respiration now, because breathing, and certainly not what you want to be breathing in either, in terms of modern, or perhaps better to say current respiration approaches, you have ventilators. If you've seen any nonsense around COVID-19, you would have seen that people complain that ventilators killed people. They don't. They do keep them alive, and the way it works is you get an endotracheal tube. This is a tube that goes down through the mouth, and sometimes the nose, into the tracheae, that is the giant tube going into the lungs, which then splits into smaller tubes, and these allow for the neck and, as a result, air passage to be kept open, and air to be pushed in and pulled out. The ventilator will control the rate, volume, and pressure of air to ensure the person involved is always oxygenated, and, somewhat more importantly, carbon dioxide is removed. In terms of the Dreadnought, it's supposed to be done via this weird amniotic fluid, but, well, in practice, it's not going to be feasible if the damage is extensive enough. The reality is that breathing requires a certain amount of, let's call it a collective effort. Mostly you have the diaphragm dropping down to increase the vacuous volume and therefore cause the lungs to expand. But also the rib cage has to do something similar, and, well, once you start punching holes in these particular structures, they no longer maintain a vacuum, or at least a lower pressure gradient, ensuring the lungs can expand and therefore draw in air, and conversely contract, pushing air out. So, to an extent, basically any damage to the abdomen and thorax of a space marine will prevent this from being a viable option, and they will have to be ventilated. Of course, in less severe cases, something like, say, a mask can be used instead of having to do a tracheostomy, but that's not as likely, given what we've described. In this case, the need for invasive methods seems very likely, and it's simply not just that damage from the initial injury, and presumably based on the very limited capacity of the Warhammer universe to fix that. You have to consider that the Space Marine that's been interred, and the Dreadnought as a whole, are put into storage for extended periods of time. At that time, the mask wouldn't be feasible, and certainly the amniotic fluid wouldn't be feasible. Mostly because, in order to be stored, they would have to be no longer able to actively breathe. Or, if they were to be done so, they would go mad in the solitude of a dank, dark, metallic box, stuck in some musty corner, waiting for them to be woken up again. More likely they're somehow put into a comatose state, or at least very close to semi-comatose, and that would require ventilation. In terms of the injuries are not easy to address. It's supposed to be that the sarcophagus will maintain the Space Marine's body and keep it in a state of suspended animation when not active. This is supposed to slow cellular degradation, and it also, depending on the exact Dreadnought, the age of it, and the chapter, incorporate limited regenerative technologies to preserve the tissues that are still there and that haven't been replaced, fixed, or otherwise dealt with by the apothecary and tech priests. But this also will somewhat depend on the chapter's particular tech priest capacity, let's say. The sarcophagus is also meant to be equipped with biomonitors and auto-injectors that are supposed to regulate the Space Marine's general physiology, administer stimulants, analgesics, and or other chemicals to maintain stability, and we'll get to these shortly. And those systems are supposed to compensate for the Space Marine's, rather significant injuries. Missing limbs are an example, but we would argue most missing limbs get replaced with some sort of prosthetic. However, organs and large portions of their torso, not so much replaceable. The first issue we have is all about organ damage and oxygenation. To start with, if you have major damage to the human body, for example from a burn or similar, there is equipment available now that allows for extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. Basically, when your heart or lungs are failing, you can get oxygen outside the body into it this way. But then we need to look at how you can manage, let's say, damage, particularly in an ongoing sense. A speculative answer is simply to treat the wound as normal, and we can start by looking at what happens in a traumatic injury, in a hospital setting at least. First of all, you control hemorrhage. You want to repair torn blood vessels, organs and similar, and remove anything that's still there that's caused the damage. For example, shrapnel. Then debride the wounds. This is removing dead tissues, and again foreign objects that may still be there. For example, material left over from an explosive. Not shrapnel, so to say, but say soot or gunpowder and dirt. This is mostly to prevent infections. And then you have amputation of any extremely damaged limbs, and this one is far more likely given the circumstances leading to the internment. A fracture stabilization of any bones that are broken, and this can be done with internal plates and screws or external fixators. And then finally, if you can, repair, patch, or otherwise deal with organs. For example, if intestines have been torn up, and they probably have been, you want to, for example, shorten them by literally cutting out the destroyed section and then reconnecting them, if possible. Other organs may not be feasible, but for example, the liver and lungs can be resectioned. Admittedly, reducing lung capacity drastically, but considering that they're inside a walking death box, probably running's not on the list of things to worry about. The liver, however, is a little more complicated, but it can regrow. And then you have the surgical preparation of the tech marine in this case, because the apothecary and tech priests will be working together to try and do what we've just described to some extent. They will try and remove any non-essential or irreparably damaged parts of the body, and they will leave only what is necessary, and we mean that quite literally. The Space Marine basically loses everything but its torso and head. Sometimes even just the brain and spinal column can be, let's say, retained. It's literally how severe the extent of the injuries can be, and in that case we would somewhat argue that the amniotic fluid actually does possibly work. And then the Space Marine is basically plugged into the sarcophagus, viral neural shunts, biotubes, and various implants. Some of these implants are already there prior to injury, some of them will have to be added afterwards. This leads to integration. Integration of the Space Marine inside of the Dreadnought sarcophagi is, let's say, a challenge. Not only is the sarcophagus sealed, but the Space Marine's consciousness is linked to it at this time, and the process is not pleasant. It's agonizing and not always successful, and so you basically have to come to a degree of acceptance that your life is now in a box, and that box has one duty: death to the heretic, mutant, and Xenos. So yes, not everybody can quite manage it. Admittedly, the brainwashing that is done by the various chapters does help considerably. Theoretically, prior to be putting into the box, the sarcophagi, any wounds that can't be dealt with via more, let's say, typical approaches would either be cauterized, theoretically allowing for most of the Space Marine to be kept, unless they've gone with the extreme approach, and this, as with many things in the Warhammer universe, means fire solves your problem. And this will be matched with things like a skin grafts where possible to ensure at least superficially injuries are covered, but the issue is that once they're inside the sarcophagi, well, if those grafts don't take or there are other complications, there is no real way to easily deal with it. And then once they're in the Dreadnought sarcophagi, your Space Marine is integrated and activated. Activation of the Dreadnought is a challenge. The Space Marine needs to be woken up and recognize their new life as a death machine. The process is going to be very traumatic and, well, depending on exactly which chapter we're talking about, acceptance of this fate may or may not be feasible. Again, indoctrination and weird religious belief may help, but some chapters are very much not pro-death box. In terms of connecting the Space Marine to the Dreadnought, we mentioned that this is actually a little bit easier, assuming again that we're talking about a relatively complete Space Marine and not just the head and spinal cord. The reason this is perhaps the easiest part of everything is that the Space Marine has a black carapace installed. The black carapace is a second layer under the skin and between the muscle. What it does is act as a sort of intermediary between the power armor of the Space Marine and their own body, allowing them to treat their power armor as a sort of a second body, almost indistinguishable from their own. This means that, in theory, it involve, let's say, suspending the Space Marine in the Dreadnought like a piece of meat and connecting all the parts of the black carapace that are still present to the Dreadnought body, and this should be roughly similar to the power armor interface, but at least in terms of the actual interface itself, it will be somewhat different. One of these has a fairly direct view of the outside world all the time through your eyes, while the other occasionally is through your own eyes, but more often through cameras, sensors, and readouts. So it's a huge adjustment in those terms, still theoretically possible. Finally, we have the waking, sleeping, and storing of the Dreadnought. If we look at this in terms of patients on life support, the waking process is perhaps an easy one to sort of understand. We'll start with the idea of bringing someone out of being comatose and on life support. And the way this happens is somewhat, let's say, dangerous, let's call it. A lot of the time, the comatose state someone on life support is put into is done using drugs. The idea here is to ensure that the individual is, at least in part, reproducing a normal circadian rhythm as much as possible. And when that can't be done, well, they do it rather directly. Assuming that there's no communication with the individual while they're completely out of it, and you rely 100% on the readouts in the machine, you can get an idea as to what's going on. So, assuming that your poor bastard space marine stuck inside this sarcophagi in the Dreadnought is being stored, you want to wake them up. You want to bring them out of suspended animation when their own, let's say, similar system was inadequate to keep them from death. We'll split this into the going to sleep stage and the waking up stage, followed by the storage stage. Hibernation is not really feasible in the modern sense, but if we look at this in, again, very much theory crafting, copyrighted, speculating, we can possibly explain this. First, hypothermia can be induced. This is called therapeutic hypothermia, and it is used in medicine now. It involves cooling the body down to somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees below normal body temperature. And this is done after cardiac arrest, and what it's meant to do is slow down metabolism. It reduces the metabolic rate by only 5 to 7% per degree decrease, so you might see anywhere between, say, 15% and maybe, let's say, 35%. So it's a notable drop, but then again, not necessarily feasible. And again, we refer to the fact that they are still biologically active. Maybe if they did something similar to animals to go into a state of torpor, that might do so, but that really only seems to be feasible for days and weeks, not possibly years, if not decades, and possibly longer again. Finally, there's some work with rodents that not only involves lowering body temperature, but also altering metabolism and trying to mimic hibernation. These studies have used mice, and using various drugs, they could induce a torpor-like state, and this will last for hours, and revival in those cases, let's say, were successful. Although successful is assuming that you're willing to accept a uncomfortable degree of loss in doing so. Cryopreservation is another option, although this does literally involve freezing the body to a temperature typically in the negative 200 range or thereabouts, using liquid nitrogen. And this one not so feasible, partly because of that whole amniotic fluid issue, partly because, well, kind of hard to wake them up relatively easily, although also technology in the 40k universe is questionable. We're not talking here Necron levels of questionable, but questionable. And it does carry a lot of risks. Damage to organs is the least of the worries, but certainly there are other issues related to that. Ice crystals causing cells to be destroyed in the bloodstream and so on. There is some speculation, and again, this is sort of going way out beyond the normal scope of speculation, that nanotechnology could help in cryogenics, mostly in avoiding issues around cell damage when you are trying to cryogenically freeze someone and, to an extent, restoring the damaged organs and tissues. This would involve tiny machines, nanomachines rather obviously, allowing the reconstruction and repair of anything damaged, and certainly removal of toxic compounds, during the process of not just putting somebody to cryogenic sleep, but waking them up afterwards. And it's that waking up afterwards that is the big problem here. Even if you were to somehow manage to miraculously freeze somebody, and theoretically they were still alive, the problem you face is that as you wake them up out of cryogenic storage, or whatever else you've used, the damage done in doing so isn't fixed immediately, but the effects of that damage do tell immediately. And so you can see, say, damage to neurons, damage to just all parts of the body that still remain. And of course, well, in the case of amniotic fluid, the fluid will, let's say, gradually freeze in a very specific way based on the not only density of the fluid, but exactly what it's made from. So, for example, if they haven't formulated it to be mindful of this particular phenomena, you might find that there is a giant ice cube with a still relatively sane and living space marine inside of it, which, that's not fun for anybody. All of this, though, assume that the brain continues to work, the neurons are preserved, and consciousness is retained. But if there's a significant damage, no. And of course, the process of being defrosted is going to affect your, let's say, sanity, quite significantly so. After all of this, you might have noticed that we've not addressed three things in proper detail yet. Analgesia, or in simple words, pain relief, we glossed over that. The treatment of the wound to an extent, again, we've sort of glossed over that. And getting the Space Marine out again. We did not address these points for some very good reasons. We didn't want to. No, there are actual good reasons for it. In terms of analgesia, things are rather straightforward. There is no way to provide long-term analgesia on the scale required for this kind of extensive traumatic injury. Every drug that exists now has existed in the past, or is described in both the Warhammer universe and just about every other universe, just isn't viable in the long term. Whether it loses efficacy, it becomes addictive, is highly toxic, or any one of 100 other problems. Long-term use, as in up to decades, if not centuries, and in some cases millennia, is just not possible. Now, we will readily admit that, yes, the Dreadnought sarcophagi isn't active and the poor Space Marine inside of it isn't awake all that time, but whether they're awake for 1 year, 10 years, a century, or even a millennia, the time frame that a drug remains effective for is limited, and it means, at best, there may be temporary analgesia when the Dreadnought is active. This is the best case scenario. Even this would still lose efficacy over the years of activity, leading to deteriorating conditions for the Space Marine, increased pain, and consequentially, decreased performance of the Marine as they deal with pain and not the heretic mutant or Xenos in front of them. It does, to a certain extent, explain why all Dreadnoughts seem to be particularly angry, though. Even if there was some miraculous drug that didn't have addiction issues, the body still, even with a Space Marine, because they are effectively a human, just a superhuman, will gradually get used to being dosed with a certain drug, and you either have to increase the dosage, which is not really a viable option in the long term, mostly because you'll see this with drug addicts that, you increase the dose enough and you eventually die, but also because it will affect their other functions. In terms of treatment, that is somewhat more simple. We've established that whatever has happened means that the Space Marine cannot be treated with the technology that exists in the universe at the time. The organs that are lost, the severity of damage, and the technology of the 40k universe are, ironically, just not up to the task of making up for the missing parts. We say ironic as, to start with, to become a Space Marine, a number of extra organs are added, which means theoretically they have the capacity to grow them, they just haven't added them back into the Space Marine. Secondary to that is that, by contrast to some of the current technologies in medicine, the 40k universe doesn't actually have them. They've lost them. And this is due to the technology dark age, but skipping over that. So, the capacity of the Dreadnought to both treat the injuries that remain after they've been interred and the treatments provided prior to interment are fairly limited. There's just no feasible way to, say, replace lost limbs, major organs, and so on. And, of course, this doesn't address the idea of the most extreme cases where you literally have just taken their head and spinal cord and called it a day. So yes, they have no way to heal the Space Marine. This is why they are in the Dreadnought sarcophagi in the first place. It is like life support machinery, but bigger, angrier, and with a strong penchant to burn. Last we have it getting the Space Marine out. Let's just say, for argument's sake, they pull another Fabius out of their collective asses at Games Workshop, and they have a way to heal these Space Marines who have been almost utterly destroyed, and in some cases literally dismantled. Well, in the latter case, you literally cannot remove them from the sarcophagi. You have a head and a spinal cord. There is no way to sustain life outside of that sarcophagi now. Even in Futurama, the talking heads have to be kept in their particular case because they won't survive outside of them. And Futurama was fairly loose in their understanding of how things work. In this case, best case scenario, possibly, vaguely, maybe, you could transfer them into a giant test tube and keep them alive in a very similar structure and somehow treat them for their injuries, but you're basically taking them out of their death box, which is useful, and putting them into a giant test tube where they won't do anything and therefore not useful. And of course, given the angry nature of Space Marines, they probably won't be too impressed with not being allowed to kill, destroy, and maim whatever it is that they're wanting to destroy at the time. So yes, even with Fabius bullshittery, there is a good chance that even that's not going to work because the necessary technology, treatments, and so on just aren't there. To get someone free from life support isn't easy, even by modern standards, and, well, the Dreadnought sarcophagi is an even more extreme case of what is effectively life support, where rather than just someone, say, experiencing traumatic brain damage or heart damage or something similar, and the rest of their body's relatively okay, in this case, most of their body is destroyed or damaged or otherwise completely able to be recovered. So let's look at what might happen to get someone out of life support and what they might theoretically have to do to recover them, possibly. First of all, you gradually wean them off the life support, and, well, this is already not feasible for a Dreadnought sarcophagi because they need the sarcophagi to live. There's no way to wean them off of it. You can't just get them to start, say, spontaneously breathing like they're supposed to do when weaning them off life support today. Reduce the ventilator settings, or, let's say, test their ability to breathe on their own. You take them out of their sarcophagi and they will die. Of course, in the modern sense, you obviously monitor respiratory rate, oxygen saturation, and for signs of distress when getting a patient off life support. But even then, that's only done for short periods of time, 30 minutes to 120 minutes. And the idea is basically to make sure they're not stressed. If there are any issues, well, they sedate them and try and ensure that they gradually wake up into the environment they're in and not, let's say, how to describe this politely, not shocked and horrified by what they're connected to and how. You don't want a reenactment of the Matrix scene. But rather, you want them waking up with minimal sedation and being gradually eased and weaned off of whatever support they have. We've already mentioned issues around dialysis, and particularly kidney function. You want to ensure that any kidney function that is there is going to work, and, well, the Space Marines don't have kidneys in all likelihood, for one of many reasons, but only a skull and spinal cord, none. If they've received traumatic damage to their abdomen, probably no kidneys either, because anti-tank rounds, even going through power armor, are going to do a lot of damage to everything present. The ability to receive nutrition is also, if not outright limited, just not there. And that's because damage, again, to the abdomen means that any means of supporting them prior to now would have to be continued. You basically don't have any way to feed them orally, which means the Space Marine is buggered in that respect. But in modern sense, the removal of all of these external supports, whether it's via nutrition or, say, a feeding tube, dialysis machines if the kidney function is normal, respirators, and so on, means that, yes, they can be sort of woken up and taken out of life support. Very slowly, but very much so. But remember, though, that the Warhammer universe is a universe where they turn human convicts, and sometimes venerated people, into servitor skulls, stationary door openers, and more because computers are bad. So the probability of having both the ability and technology to do this, monitoring them very carefully, providing all the requisite support and everything else is kind of unlikely, if not extremely so. This is why we'd argue the Dreadnought sarcophagi is the worst fate in the Warhammer universe, as your suffering is not just prolonged, but actively prolonged by the chapter working to keep you going, despite the constant suffering, and 100 or more angry-powered armored marching men can prove to be a very powerful force when keeping the living from becoming the dead. Then you have issues with just the physical degradation. Inside this box, you are kept alive for decades, centuries, and in some examples, millennia. And the life support systems within the Dreadnought sarcophagi aren't really up to the task for maintaining somebody for that long. Although described as organic components, these are your organs, tissues, and, somewhat importantly, your brain will deteriorate over time, and definitely over centuries. There are some chapters that get around this using stasis fields to preserve the occupant during long periods of activity, but they are rare, incredibly rare, and basically, even within those chapters that have them, only available in very limited numbers. And sort of the bigger issue to this is that, assuming you aren't a member of one of those chapters and you aren't one of those Space Marines that are so fortunate as to have it, the mental strain of not just the isolation of being entombed is all sorts of problems. Imagine what it's like in isolation in a prison. An isolation cell there is already considered cruel and unusual in many cases, and people are only kept in those sort of rooms, depending on the exact circumstances, for say a week. Sometimes significantly longer, but let's just say for a week. Having zero connection to the outside world for just a week is enough to start making people go crazy. And the Space Marine is interred inside of the Dreadnought sarcophagi for up to centuries, if not millennia. The fact that they can keep their sanity at all between battles that they're called up for is amazing, but it's only going to last so long, and only being awakened when needed is a big question too. On top of the whole issue of basically freeze-thaw cycles and constantly waking somebody up and putting them to sleep again. That means that the mental strain can be exacerbated drastically. Consider what might happen with, say, a crusade. A crusade can take centuries, if not millennia. And finally, we have the issue of maintenance. The Dreadnought sarcophagi requires regular maintenance by chapter tech priests and tech marines, and this is to ensure its systems remain fully functional. But remember, this is a battle system. You are meant to go into the forefront of a fight, and this can be with some pretty big nasty opponents. The damage to the Dreadnought in those battles cannot just be extreme to the machine and therefore fatal to the occupant, but just fatal to the occupant full stop. And on top of that, consider this. Your life is literally wake up, go out, kill something, come back, sleep. That is not exactly a good life. And of course we have the fact that, well, you literally get beaten around, shaken, and otherwise hurt by literally just being in the sarcophagi at the time. Amniotic fluid can only go so far in dampening that effect. And of course, finally, if the repairs aren't done in time, and presumably you weren't killed directly in the battle, the occupant, let's call them, of the Dreadnought sarcophagi is, well, going to die from the lack of being able to repair it. It's very much like if, say, a ventilator stops for somebody who can't breathe. You will suffocate to death slowly, but in this case, rather than suffocating slowly, you're basically going to die slowly in a dark, damp, isolated box where you have no idea what's happening in the outside world. You just know that you're dying. This is why the Dreadnought sarcophagi is, in our opinion, the worst possible fate in the Warhammer universe. Somewhat disconcertingly feasible, but still, not a fate that we would wish on just about anybody. And as such, yes, it could happen, but no, just no. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.